Happy New Year. Thanks, Paul. If you're new with us today, so glad that you're here. Welcome, and I want to make sure that you know that we would love to connect with you. There's a welcome card in the bulletin. If you got the physical bulletin, you can tear that out, throw that in the box out by the pastor's shelf. That's where we collect our tithes and offerings and also those cards. And I would love to receive that so we can just connect with you. If you didn't get a physical bulletin, if you want to go on the app and go through that process, and there's a digital welcome card that you could fill out there. And again, we'd love to be able to make contact with you and help you to know how you can get more connected here at Grace. So glad that you're with us today. And excited to get back into our Exodus series. So grateful for the pastors and elders that preached through Advent, and it's good to hear some other voices every now and then, isn't it? That's where you say, no, John, we want to hear you every week. No. Really glad to hear from those guys, and glad to also give myself a chance to work on some other things for the new year that we'll get a chance to talk about at another time. But we are continuing our series in Exodus, and we've been looking at the book of Exodus, just as a reminder for those of you that have been with us and those of you that haven't, catch you up. We're looking at Exodus and through the lens of understanding that God is taking the Israelites from what the Apostle Peter describes as not a people, a loosely affiliated group of people that are just related to each other, to becoming the people of God, and the formation that God brings about through the Exodus story to bring that formation in them, and also seeing our own story through a similar light of how does God turn us, how does he form us into his people. That's what we've been looking at in Exodus, and so we're picking up in chapter 12 today as we look at the final plague that God brings upon the land of Egypt. But before we get to that, I want to take a minute to just have a deep breath with you. We made it through Christmas. Does it feel good to be on the other side? It's actually a trick question, because some of you know we're not actually through Christmas, are we? Christmas is not just one day, but we actually celebrate 12 days of Christmas. And so we're coming up on Epiphany here on the 6th, which, does anybody remember what Epiphany represents? It's the time when the wise men came. That's what we celebrate on Epiphany. But more broadly than that, what we're actually celebrating on Epiphany is that the gospel, the revelation of Jesus, comes to the Gentiles. That's what Epiphany is really about. And so the celebrations are not over. And if that sounds exhausting to you, that's okay. That's okay. We started to tear down some of our Christmas decorations at home, probably like many of you have already also. That's okay. But we really celebrate Jesus every day. It's not just according to what we call these holidays. Why am I lingering on this morning, though? Because we're going to be looking at not just the last plague, the Passover, but also the Passover festival. The festival of unleavened bread is another word for it. And God is establishing in his people a new system of celebrating him, celebrating what God has done and is doing. And God uses holidays to bring formation to his people. Did you know that? So that's what we're going to look at today. Very fitting that this is where we're at today, more so than what I've even said so far. So let's go ahead and get into our story, Exodus chapter 12. And we'll see what that's all about. Starting in verse 1, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it, listen to this, on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roast it over a fire, with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it till morning. If some of it is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals. And I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This is a day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come, you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, remove the yeast from your houses. For whoever eats anything with yeast in it from the first day through the 7th must be cut off from Israel. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly, and on another one on the 7th day. Do no work at all on these days, except to prepare food for everyone to eat. That is all you may do. Celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. In the first month you are to eat bread made without yeast, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. For 7 days no yeast is to be found in your houses, and anyone, whether foreigner or native born, who eats anything with yeast in it must be cut off from the community of Israel. Eat nothing made with yeast. Wherever you live, you must eat unleavened bread. Stick with me. Let's keep going. Verse 21, and Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, go at once and select the animals for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on the top and on both sides of the doorframe. None of you shall go out of the door of your house until morning. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and the sides of the doorframe and will pass over that doorway, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. Obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. When you enter the land that the Lord will give you as he promised, observe this ceremony. And when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you, then tell them. It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians. And then the people bowed down and worshipped. The Israelites did just what the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. We're almost done. Keep going. 31. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have been requesting. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me. The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we will all die. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for, and so they plundered the Egyptians. The Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children, and many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. And with the dough the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. Congratulations. You made it through. I know that's a long passage, and we could have covered a lot more ground. But it was actually, we skipped over chapter 11 because there was a fair amount of repetition in there. But I wanted you to get the breadth of the story that's taking place there to understand what's going on. So if you were to read chapter 11, you might get a little bit confused because Moses is talking to Pharaoh and he's explaining how God's going to bring this plague on the people of Egypt, that the firstborn, the destroyer is going to come and take the firstborn. And then there's chapter 12, and we all of a sudden get this description of a festival. And then we hear God bringing the destroyer. And there's kind of this back and forth between God bringing this plague and then this festival. And it's just kind of going back and forth, and it's kind of confusing. And what's actually taking place, and you may not get the first read-through, is that the Passover, the literal Passover of the destroyer coming, bringing the plague, marks the first day of the festival of unleavened bread. These are happening simultaneously, which is so curious and so interesting that God would bring this plague, and it also is marking this time where God wants them to have celebration. And they're kind of butted up next to each other, and they're supposed to bake this unleavened bread. But in the first night they do it in their homes, but the rest of the 6 days of the festival, they're not at home anymore, are they? They're on the move. And so you can begin to see why the bread's unleavened, because they didn't have time to bake it like they would have if they had had the time and then be able to prepare it the way they would like to in their homes. And so it became known as the Festival of Unleavened Bread because they were in haste. They were leaving. They were fleeing from Egypt, and they were on the run. They were on the move to a place unknown, right? They know ultimately the promised land is Canaan, but they don't know what that's like. They don't know what to expect. They don't know how long it's going to take to get there. They don't know what life will be like and when they'll get to set up home and shop and so forth when that comes. There's so much unknown at this point, and yet God says, celebrate. Have holiday. Holy day. And not for one day, but for 7. Before we get to the festival, though, we need to make sure we spend a little bit of time talking about the Passover itself, the coming of the destroyer, the final plague on Egypt. And I think it's important to back up a little bit and just remind ourselves, why is God doing this? Because this is devastating, isn't it? God takes the firstborn children and livestock of the Egyptians. Notice that God doesn't spare the Israelites for the homes that choose not to paint the blood on the doorframe too, though. The Israelites have to participate in the way that God prescribes in order to remain unaffected by the destroyers as the destroying angel comes through and wipes out the firstborn. So, why is God bringing these plagues in the first place? Let's back up a little bit. There's 4 main reasons that I want to remind us about for why God is bringing these plagues and why God is bringing ultimately this final plague on Egypt. And the first one we were actually reminded about in the passage we read today, which is that God is bringing judgment on the Egyptian gods. God is bringing judgment on the Egyptian gods, okay? And that includes Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh himself would have seen himself as a deity. The people of Egypt saw him as a deity. And God says, I am the only God. These other false gods are not worthy of worship. And so he's bringing judgment on them. That is also to say that Yahweh is showing his own supremacy. He is worthy of worship. He is worthy of praise. And so there's kind of a dual reason that go together there. The third reason that we've seen in the last handful of plagues is God is also bringing distinction to his people. Right? God is saying there's something different about the Egyptian people from the Israelite people. I have favored the Israelite people. And not because they're special, but because I've chosen them as my special possession. Okay? Bringing distinction to his people is also another way that God brings glory to himself. Right? When God shows distinction between the Israelites and the Egyptians, it's a way of people being able to see tangibly, there's something different about these Israelite people over here, and it's not because of who they are, but what? Because of who their God is, right? And so, again, back to why the children? Why is this the last plague? And here's the final reason that I wanted to share with you this morning. It's because God is specifically bringing judgment on the firstborn. And if you go back to one of the earlier chapters where we talked about God describing Israel as his firstborn, God is bringing judgment on them. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Let me back up. So he's bringing judgment on Egypt for withholding, abusing, and condemning God's firstborn. Okay, let me explain what I mean. Judgment for withholding God's firstborn, meaning Israel. Pharaoh would not let God's people go, right? So Pharaoh's withholding. Egypt is withholding God's firstborn from him, okay? So it's judgment for withholding. There's also judgment for abusing God's firstborn. Egypt abused God's chosen people, his firstborn, Israel, by the severe labor that they imposed upon them in slavery. Okay? And then finally, God is bringing judgment on them for condemning his firstborn, Israel. Remember how Moses was put in a basket? Why was he put in a basket when he was a baby? Because Pharaoh had decreed that all of the firstborn males of Israel would be killed when they were born. And that didn't end up happening, but Pharaoh had made that decree that would happen. And so Moses was probably not the only baby that was an Israelite mother tried to have spared and carry out in secret. Okay? So because Egypt is withholding, abusing, and condemning God's firstborn, Israel, God is bringing justice by condemning the firstborn of Egypt. So, I think it's really safe to say that God is acting justly by taking the firstborn of Egypt, but you might find yourself saying, maybe it's justified, but is that good enough? Is it heartless of God to do and act like this? And here's what how I would answer that. God gave several warnings to Pharaoh and to Egypt that this would come if they would not adhere to what he had told them to do. From the very beginning, from Moses' first confrontation of Pharaoh, Moses warns them that God might bring the sword if Pharaoh would not let the people go. All along the way. In fact, every single plague we talked about is a warning to Pharaoh of the supremacy of Yahweh and how God is not going to spare Egypt if they will not adhere to what God is telling them to do, meaning let the people of Israel go. And so we see plague after plague that God brings some level of destruction or death to the people of Egypt. And so he's been building up, so to speak, to this final plague all the way along. So there's been warning after warning that this is coming. And so while this is severe, while this is devastating, we also have a clear sense that we read this in chapter 12, verse 33, that the Egyptians themselves had a clear sense that Yahweh had spared their lives. He had taken the firstborn, but he took it as a mercy upon the Egyptian people to not just wipe them out utterly. That is the impression that the Egyptians themselves had about God taking out this plague upon them. Not that God imposed it upon them, but because Pharaoh decided not to comply, that they signed themselves up for it, in a sense, by not adhering to God's command. And so they understood that Yahweh was being merciful by not wiping out the Egyptian people altogether. So God is demonstrating his greatness while at the same time trying to save a civilization from utter destruction and judgment. Okay? Does that make sense? God's seeing this at such a grander scale than we do. And this is the first night of this week of the festival of unleavened bread. It's a somber, it's a holy, it's a sobering experience. Can you imagine being the Israelites huddled in these homes, blood over the door frame, just kind of waiting out the night, knowing that the destroyer is out there in the land? What a sobering experience that must have been. And so the rest of the festival is in transition to wilderness life. And as they're on their way out of Egypt, they plunder the Egyptians. Remember how God told them he told Moses they were going to do this from the very beginning. Before Moses even showed up back in Egypt, he told them that they were going to plunder the Egyptians and take all of these riches with them to sustain the community out in the wilderness. Notice that we read in verse 38 that I actually want to read this again, just in case you missed it. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. Not just Israel went up out of Egypt. Did you know that? It's kind of a passing comment. You almost miss it. But the Israelites are not the only ones to leave Egypt. And God actually makes a way for people who are not natively Israelite to be grafted in to the Israelite people. And they are allowed to even participate in this festival of unleavened bread if only they'll be fully brought into the Israelite community, and every male had to be circumcised. And so even at this early stage of Israelite history, we see God grafting in non-native people into his family. Pretty cool. Okay. We could spend the whole time talking about that, but what I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about, as we mentioned at the beginning, was the festival itself and how formative it is for them and how formative holy days are for us as well. And so you saw right from the get-go in chapter 12 that God tells them to reorganize their calendar. Did you catch that part? He says, this is going to be the first month of your year. In other words, you're going to reorient your whole life around this experience. Not just your lives, but your people from here forward. We're changing the trajectory of history by reorienting your people around your experience of me here and now. Okay? This is the defining event for them and for generations to come. And in fact, if you know your Old Testament pretty well, you see God bringing up over and over again how he's the one that what? Brought them up out of Egypt. It's the defining event of their people. And so they celebrate the festival of unleavened bread for 7 days. And so we read about how they're supposed to acquire this lamb on the 10th day. It has to be a lamb without blemish. Okay, that's really important. We'll come back to that. Day 14 is when the slaughtering happens. So they've got to keep this lamb alive and well fed for 4 days. And probably you're getting a little bit attached to this baby, cute little lamb for 4 days. And then they have to slaughter it for the meal to either for their family or maybe sometimes for another family if their family can't consume the lamb all by themselves. Okay, and then they do this really strange thing of painting the blood on the door frame of the house. What is that all about? Well, we know from other passages of the Old Testament that to God, blood represents life, right? And so as this lamb is slaughtered, and a lamb without blemish is slaughtered, and the blood is painted over the doorframe, what that's saying symbolically is, may the life of this animal, this perfect animal without blemish, be a substitution for the lives of the people in this home. It's what we call theologically a substitutionary atonement. Okay? Why did God require this of them? Why couldn't he just have the destroyer spare them anyway? And what God is trying to implant in his people now is, again, the Israelite people are not a special people. God is an incredible God, and people, regardless if they're Egyptian or Israelite or anybody else, are people that have sin. And so he requires them to have a lamb without blemish. And in other words, it's symbolically showing that this animal is perfect, i.e., without sin. Okay? And so this one without sin is taking the place of the ones with sin so that atonement can happen for that sin. Does that make sense? Okay? Stick with me. We're gonna come back to that again later. Okay? And so day 14 and day 21 of that first month, there's no working. Okay? It's like an extra 2 Sabbaths that are happening during this festival. No work is to happen except for the preparing of the food. And then it's bookended with holy assemblies on the front end and on the back end of this festival, the Festival of Unleavened Bread. What does it mean by a holy assembly? It doesn't necessarily mean a church service, although later in Jewish history we see it become that. But what it meant in a more literal sense is a convocation or a special reading or a liturgy. It's some kind of holy ceremony. At this point, it's within those households, marking the beginning and the ending of the festival. Okay? And then we read, of course, that they're carrying the dough of the unleavened bread with them as they're going into the wilderness because they had no time to prepare it properly. Okay, I just walked you through a little bit of what our passage said in terms of what the actual festival consisted of. But what I want to do as we kind of come to the application of what we've been talking about is kind of taking some of the principles of those things so that we can understand how is God bringing formation through this experience? What can we take away from it? And so first of all, we just want to reiterate, God instituted holy festivals as an act of worship and formation. God is doing both in this experience. Not just in the Festival of Unleavened Bread, but we see throughout Israel's history, God instituted other festivals too, right? We know that there's 3 prominent ones, okay? And so what does it mean to celebrate holidays or holy days well? And so I just want to, again, extrapolate some of the things that we see from this festival, but also from some of the other festivals throughout Jewish culture. And by the way, if you want to go and read about some of these other festivals, I'll give you some references. Leviticus 23, Numbers 28 and 29, and Deuteronomy 16 are good places to go to read more about those. So there's the 3 prominent festivals. There's the unleavened bread or Passover. There's the Festival of Weeks, which is the same thing as the Festival of Pentecost. It marks it's about celebrating the harvest, okay? And then there's the Festival of Tabernacles. The Festival of Tabernacles is to commemorate their journey in the wilderness and how they lived in temporary shelters in the wilderness. And they actually, during the Festival of Tabernacles, they would actually build a temporary dwelling that they would live in for the duration of the festival. So those are the three main festivals that the Jewish people celebrate. And actually says that later in their history that they would all travel to Jerusalem. The males were required to travel to Jerusalem to celebrate these festivals. But that's a tradition that would come later. So what are we to take away from celebrating holidays well? What does it mean to celebrate holidays well? Good question to ask right after Christmas. Well, it should be marked by some holy assemblies, liturgies, scriptures, prayers. There should probably, if I were to extrapolate from our passages, I would say there should be a mix of some celebratory components to celebrating holidays well, but also some solemn components, right? We see that in the Passover. There's reason for excitement. They're being freed from slavery, but there's also some solemnity to what had to take place in order for that to happen, right? So there's a mixture of both going on there. Foods are always important for celebrating holidays well, right? Special foods, and so we see this with the unleavened bread, particularly for the Passover. Special foods are a part of that. I think another really key one is there's some reenactment or retelling of the story going on whenever we celebrate the holiday. If a holiday goes by and we don't actually talk about the reason for the holiday, we've probably missed something, right? So retelling the story is super important. We try to do that as we gather for Christmas Eve, Christmas Day. But, I think that what our passage demonstrates for us well is that the Israelites are retelling the story in their own homes with their own children, grandchildren. They're passing on the story to the next generation. We read about that in the passage itself, about passing it on to our children. When they ask us, why do we do this? We actually tell them what it means. I wonder if sometimes holidays should be marked with some pilgrimage. We see that in some of the holidays that the Israelites celebrate. There's traveling involved. Some of us have done some traveling recently, or maybe we're still on our travels right now. As we already mentioned, there should be an element of passing things on to the next generation. We also see in here some hospitality going on, don't we? Right? As these families would share a lamb with each other, if their family wasn't large enough to consume the whole thing, that they would share with each other. There's an aspect of hospitality. In fact, the family would come to share the lamb with them for the meal, and then they would probably stay in that home, at least on that first Passover night. They would stay in the home with them as the destroyer was passing over, because the blood was only on the door frames of the homes where the lambs were being prepared. Okay? We also see, and I think this is really key for us today, is these festivals are multi-day. We try to cram everything onto the day, don't we? What if we just spread it out a little bit? And not packed in every single one of those days, but just spread it out a little bit? I wonder if our holiday celebrations would be a little bit more life-giving than life-draining. The final thing that I want to point out that I think might be an important aspect of celebrating holidays well is an aspect of denial in the way that they celebrate. They went without yeast in their bread. They were traveling in the wilderness. There's a sense of denial going on there, right? Not everything is the way that they would like for it to be, or that perhaps we think it ought to be, right? And so there's a sense of denial there. I just mentioned the Festival of Tabernacles, where they're living out in a temporary shelter. There's some sacrifice there, right? Living out in a temporary shelter for a period of time. So I wonder if there's a time for feasting, but there's also a time of denial or aspects of denial in our celebrations. So, just some food for thought. I thought those might be helpful for us in thinking about the way that we celebrate holidays, Christian holidays particularly. And so, here's a reflection, a step for you to consider today. Looking back at Christmas, do you have the sense that you celebrated Jesus' incarnation well or appropriately? Take some time to think about that. You know, when somebody asks, how was your Christmas? What's the filter that you run that through? Everybody got the presents that they wanted? Minimal familial conflict? A little bit of downtime maybe? Maybe you did that one special thing that you love to do every year. You got to watch that film that you love to watch every year. What makes it a good Christmas? Is it those things? Or not? So how do you know that you celebrated Christmas or any other Christian holiday well? Here's a step for you to consider. Prayerfully consider how you can give more intentionality to celebrating Christian holidays, holy days, well. What are one or two things you want to do differently or better in the future? This is the time to figure those things out. By the time the holidays roll around again, it's too late, right? We need to take time now, recently after the holiday, to be able to reflect meaningfully about what did we do well, maybe what some things that we could improve on. This is the best time to do that. Okay? Let's pray. God, we know that Christmas is all about you. We know that all of these Christian holidays are about you. And yet, oftentimes, we make them about us, or we make them about the kids. We make them about the experience. And I know oftentimes, God, we can come out of these holidays feeling depleted, disappointed. That's not your intent at all. So God, I pray for all of us as we reflect on what it means to celebrate well, that you would give inspiration, that you would give insight about how we can do that differently. God, I know that you're not intending condemnation on anybody today for the way that they celebrated Christmas this year. That's not your intent. But you want to bring meaningful experience, meaningful formation to our lives, and you want to use holidays to do that. We pray for your grace and for your mercy and for your wisdom to do that. In Jesus' name, amen. So how fitting that we celebrate communion today as we talk about the Passover. And if you haven't made the connection yet, Jesus redefines the Passover. So when he comes, and when he comes to Jerusalem before his crucifixion, do you remember the occasion upon which they show up in Jerusalem? It's at Passover. And so they celebrate Passover in the upper room. And Jesus describes for them, as they take the bread and the wine together, that it's his body and it's his blood. And we come to understand that Jesus is telling his original disciples, that while for the original Passover participants, that unblemished lamb was the substitutionary atonement, symbolically for them, that Jesus himself, who is perfect, who is sinless, would be the true Passover lamb. In fact, when John the Baptist sees him coming, he describes him in what way? Behold the Lamb of God who comes to take away what? The sin of the world. 1 Corinthians 5, 6 through 8. Paul's writing to the Corinthians, and they've been boasting about some of the sin that their community has been delving into because of the great grace of God being on display in that situation. And Paul tells them this: your boasting is not good. Don't you know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast so that you may be a new unleavened batch, as you really are. He's referring to the Passover, right? For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival, not with the old bread leavened with malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. What's Paul saying? It's not the leaven, it's not the yeast that really matters. It's what it represents. And that's why we have a leavened loaf of bread up here. It's not really about the leaven. It's not about the yeast. It's about the state of our hearts. It's about our own purity and how Jesus, in his purity, made a way for us to be atoned, to be right with God, that we might be also passed over. Is that good news? It's good news. Elders, I'll invite you to come up as we get ready to celebrate. As they're coming, let me just remind you, if you can come down the center aisle, exit out the side aisle. We do have one of our elders who's ready to come to you. If you're unable to come forward, just raise your hand, and Andy will spot you and come bring the elements to you. And you'll take the elements on your own. So either step off to the side or bring it back to your seat and take it as you're ready. So on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he did take bread, and he broke it after giving thanks, and he gave it to his disciples, saying, "This is my body, broken for you." And after the supper, he took the cup, and after giving thanks, he told his disciples, "This is my blood of the new covenant shed for you. Do this in remembrance of me."